Have you ever made a snap judgment about someone, only to later realize just how wrong you were? Maybe it was a waiter at a restaurant, a janitor at an office, or a customer service representative on the phone. At first glance, they seemed insignificant, just another person doing their job. But then, something happened that completely shifted your perspective. Suddenly, the person you had dismissed was someone much more important than you had assumed. Today's story is a perfect example of that. It's about a group of wealthy travelers who looked down on a flight attendant, treating her with arrogance and disrespect. What they didn't know: she wasn't just a flight attendant, she was the CEO of the airline. What followed was a lesson in humility that none of them would ever forget. It was a bright, bustling morning at JFK International Airport in New York. The terminals were alive with movement, passengers wheeling their luggage, flight announcements echoing over the speakers, and the occasional coffee spill as travelers hurried to their gates. Among them was Linda Parker, dressed in a crisp navy blue uniform, her name tag neatly pinned on her blazer. She greeted passengers with a warm smile, helping some with their boarding passes and pointing others in the right direction. To anyone watching, she was just another dedicated flight attendant, ready for another day in the sky. But Linda Parker wasn't just another flight attendant. She had been in the airline industry for over 20 years, starting out serving drinks and snacks at 35,000 feet before climbing her way up through the ranks. Today, she was the CEO of American Horizon Airlines. She had built the company with a commitment to excellence, safety, and respect, values that she still held close. And today, instead of sitting in an executive suite, she chose to step back into the uniform she once wore, working alongside her team to see firsthand the challenges they faced every day. This wasn't the first time Linda had done this. She believed that the best way to lead was by staying connected to the people who made the airline run smoothly. Her employees knew her well, at least those who had been around long enough. But to the passengers boarding that morning's flight to Los Angeles, she was just another crew member. And that was exactly how she wanted it. She didn't know it yet, but this flight would be different. On board, she would come face to face with a group of passengers who saw her uniform, not as a badge of dedication, but as a sign of inferiority. They would make assumptions about her, mock her, and treat her as if she was beneath them. But by the end of the flight, they would learn that titles don't define a person, character does. Now, let me ask you, if you were in Linda's shoes, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet and let karma run its course? Would you have revealed your identity right away to put them in their place? Or would you have handled it with patience and grace? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're at it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories like this. Now, let's get back to our flight. As passengers boarded the aircraft, the distinct hum of chatter filled the cabin. Among the steady flow of travelers, one group immediately stood out in first class. Their tailored suits, designer accessories, and casual arrogance set them apart. The way they carried themselves, lounging comfortably with an air of entitlement, made it clear they weren't used to waiting or being told what to do. Richard Thompson, a well-known hedge fund manager, occupied the prime seat near the window. His neatly pressed navy suit and polished leather shoes screamed success. Beside him sat Charles, his longtime business partner, and Veronica, a socialite with a reputation for flaunting her wealth. Their conversation, loud and unfiltered, carried through the cabin as other passengers quietly found their seats. Linda, in her familiar navy blue uniform, moved through the aisle, assisting passengers with a warm smile. As she approached first class, she caught Richard's eye. He leaned back, raising an eyebrow. "Wow, these flight attendants really love their jobs, don't they?" His voice carried an unmistakable hint of mockery. "Must be desperate for tips." Charles smirked, adjusting his watch, the diamond face catching the cabin lights. "I always wonder what drives someone to choose this job. I mean, long hours, low pay, and all for what? To serve people like us?" Veronica, swirling the champagne in her flute, let out a soft chuckle. "She's probably just here to look pretty and bring us drinks." "Nothing wrong with that, though." Linda heard every word. Years of experience had taught her to remain composed in situations like this. She maintained her professional smile, checking their seatbelts and moving on, unfazed. The young flight attendant beside her, however, glanced at Linda with disbelief, as if expecting some kind of reaction. But Linda didn't react. Not yet. She had encountered passengers like them before, the type who saw uniforms as a symbol of servitude rather than service. She knew that people who judged others by their professions often failed to recognize the humanity behind the role. This was just another flight, another group of entitled travelers. Or so they thought. As the aircraft door closed and the flight attendants moved through their final safety checks, Richard reclined in his seat, gesturing lazily toward the crew. Let's hope they actually know what they're doing. I'd rather not have a mid-air disaster because some underpaid worker missed a step. A few passengers nearby exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with the way Richard and his friends were behaving. But Richard didn't seem to notice, nor did he care. He continued speaking as if the cabin were his private boardroom, oblivious to the growing tension around him. As Linda walked past again, Veronica tilted her head, appraising her as one might a showroom mannequin. "You have a lovely uniform," she mused, the condescension in her tone barely concealed. "Do you actually like wearing it, or is it just part of the job?" Linda met her gaze, the faintest flicker of amusement in her eyes. "It's more than just a uniform," she replied smoothly. "It represents dedication, professionalism, and a commitment to safety." Veronica blinked, caught off guard by the poised response. Richard, however, only smirked. "Well, as long as you bring my drinks on time, I don't mind what it represents." Linda remained unshaken. She had handled rude passengers before, and she knew that some lessons in life weren't taught with words. Sometimes, people had to learn through experience. And as fate would have it, Richard and his friends were about to receive a lesson they would never forget. The flight had been smooth up until that moment, cruising at 35,000 feet with passengers comfortably settled into their seats. Some read their newspapers, others watched movies, and a few enjoyed quiet conversations. The soft hum of the aircraft provided a calming background to the routine of air travel. But then, a sudden commotion shattered the peace. Richard, who had just been making a snide remark to Charles about the airline's lack of five-star accommodations, suddenly clutched his chest. His glass of champagne slipped from his hand, crashing onto the floor. His face drained of color as he struggled to breathe, his body trembling. With a weak gasp, he collapsed into the aisle. A collective gasp spread through the cabin. Veronica let out a sharp cry, dropping her designer purse as she scrambled to her feet. Charles turned pale, staring in horror at his friend sprawled on the ground. Other passengers twisted in their seats, eyes wide with concern, unsure of what to do. Linda was already moving before anyone else had fully processed what was happening. Years of experience had trained her for emergencies just like this. She dropped to her knees beside Richard, her voice firm but calm. "Get the oxygen mask." "Call for a doctor," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. A junior flight attendant rushed to retrieve the emergency oxygen while another crew member signaled to the cabin for medical assistance. Amid the growing panic, a few passengers murmured, their voices thick with concern. A woman 2 rows behind leaned toward her husband. "Do you think he's having a heart attack?" she whispered, clutching her armrest. Veronica, completely undone by the situation, gripped Charles's sleeve. "Somebody do something," she cried, her voice shaking. "We are doing something," Linda assured her, pressing 2 fingers to Richard's neck to check for a pulse. It was rapid, but faint. "Stay back and give him space. We need to keep him stable." A man from the middle of the cabin quickly stepped forward. "I'm a doctor," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. He crouched beside Linda, giving Richard a quick but thorough assessment. "He's experiencing a severe medical episode. Let's get the oxygen mask on him now." The flight attendant who had retrieved the oxygen hurried back, handing it to Linda. She swiftly secured the mask over Richard's nose and mouth, adjusting the flow to deliver the proper amount of oxygen. His breathing was still labored, but after a few tense moments, his gasps slowed, his chest rising and falling more steadily. The panic in his eyes, however, remained. Richard was no longer the confident, smug businessman who had mocked the flight crew earlier. Now, he looked utterly helpless, vulnerable in a way he had likely never been before. He stared at Linda, his expression a mix of confusion and fear. The doctor continued his examination, speaking in low, reassuring tones. "We need to monitor him closely until we land. His vitals are stabilizing, but we'll want paramedics ready when we arrive." Veronica knelt beside Richard, gripping his hand. "You're okay, Richard," she whispered, her bravado completely gone. "Just breathe." Linda met the doctor's eyes, silently confirming that the worst had passed for now. She then looked at the rest of the passengers, many of whom were still watching in stunned silence. "Everything is under control," she announced, her voice even and reassuring. "Please remain in your seats while we continue monitoring the situation." One by one, passengers turned back, murmuring quietly to each other. The tension in the cabin lingered, but the immediate crisis had passed. Linda exhaled slowly, steadying herself as she looked down at Richard once more. This was the moment everything changed. The cabin was still, the only sound the faint hum of the aircraft as it continued its steady course through the sky. The tension that had once filled the air was now replaced with something entirely different, an almost reverent silence. Charles, his face still pale from the ordeal, turned to Linda, his voice unsteady but filled with something bordering on admiration. "You handled that like a pro," he said, still catching his breath. "What kind of training do they give you flight attendants?" Linda paused for a moment, considering her response. A small smile played on her lips as she glanced around the cabin, seeing the eyes of passengers now filled with curiosity rather than disdain. Then, with a calm, measured voice, she spoke. "Actually, I'm the CEO of this airline." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Silence. Absolute, stunned silence. Richard, who was still recovering, struggled to sit up straighter, his breathing steadying but his mind now in a tailspin. His face, once flushed from distress, was now a mix of shock and disbelief. "Wait, what?" he stammered, his eyes searching Linda's face as if hoping for some indication that this was a joke. Linda nodded, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "I started as a flight attendant years ago. I worked my way up through different roles, learning every part of the business, and eventually became CEO. And today," she continued, "I wanted to step back into this role to remind myself what my team goes through every day." The weight of her words settled over the cabin. Charles blinked, still processing what he had just heard. Veronica, who had earlier dismissed Linda with a casual wave of her hand, now stared at her with wide, almost guilty eyes. "You mean to tell us," Charles finally spoke, shaking his head slightly, "that the person we've been talking down to this whole flight is actually running the entire airline?" Linda gave a gentle nod, her smile never wavering. "That's exactly what I'm saying." A few passengers in nearby seats, who had been quietly observing, exchanged glances. Some leaned forward slightly, clearly intrigued by the revelation. The very same woman they had watched being dismissed and mocked was, in reality, the person in charge of the entire operation. Richard let out a short, breathless laugh, shaking his head. "I don't believe it." "I mean," he paused, looking at Linda again. "You're telling me you went from serving drinks on these flights to actually running the airline?" "That's right," Linda replied, her voice steady. "I believe the best way to lead is by understanding every level of your organization. I wanted to remember what it's like to be on the front lines, to serve passengers firsthand, and to ensure that the values of this airline are upheld at every level." For the first time since boarding, Richard had no clever remarks, no snide comments. He simply sat there, processing the weight of Linda's words. Meanwhile, Veronica seemed almost unable to look Linda in the eye. The woman who had moments ago made remarks about Linda's uniform, about her position, now sat quietly, her fingers playing with the hem of her designer blouse. "I misjudged you," she finally admitted, her voice softer than before. I think we all did. Linda tilted her head slightly. Perhaps. But misjudging someone isn't the problem, it's whether or not we learn from it. The cabin seemed to breathe collectively, passengers absorbing the lesson that had unfolded before them. The very same passengers who had looked on, some amused, some indifferent, now saw Linda not just as an airline employee, but as a leader who had chosen humility over status. A voice from behind them broke the silence. That's real leadership. The words came from an older gentleman in the row behind Richard. He had been watching everything unfold, a knowing expression on his face. Too many people in power forget what it means to do the real work, he continued. You've got my respect, Miss Parker. A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. Some passengers, who had initially ignored the commotion, now nodded, a newfound respect in their expressions. Linda, ever composed, simply nodded in gratitude. She had no need for applause, no need for grand recognition. The lesson had been taught, and that was enough. Richard exhaled deeply, looking between his friends. He wasn't sure what to say, how to fix the arrogance they had so freely displayed. But for once, he was silent. The flight continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations were quieter, more reflective. Some passengers glanced at Linda with newfound admiration, while others, like Veronica and Charles, sat in their seats, lost in thought. Linda turned back to her duties, walking through the cabin with the same professionalism she had displayed all along. But this time, as she passed each row, she wasn't just another flight attendant in a navy blue uniform. She was the woman who had redefined leadership without ever having to raise her voice. And for Richard, Veronica, and Charles, this would be a flight they would never forget. Veronica was the first to break the silence. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clasped them together, glancing at Charles before turning her gaze back to Linda. I don't know what to say, she admitted, her voice softer than anyone had heard before. We were awful to you. We judged you, belittled you, and never once considered the possibility that you were someone we should have respected from the start. I'm sorry. Charles nodded, his usual air of smug confidence gone. He looked down at his hands, as if ashamed of how they had waved her off earlier. Yeah, he muttered. I was a real jerk. He glanced up, forcing himself to meet Linda's eyes. I should have known better. We all should have. Linda steadied them both, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled gently, a warmth in her eyes that softened the tension in the air. Acknowledging it is the first step, she said. But true change comes from what we do next. Richard, still seated but looking much stronger now, exhaled a deep breath. He had barely spoken since learning Linda's true identity, the weight of his arrogance pressing down on him in a way he never thought possible. Finally, he spoke. I owe you my life, he said, his voice filled with something unfamiliar, humility. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened. He swallowed hard, then continued. All this time, I thought power was about money, about control. But I see it now. Real power is in how you treat people. You could have embarrassed us, made a scene, but instead, you handled everything with grace. He shook his head, letting out a breathy chuckle at himself. I guess I never really understood what leadership looked like until today. Linda gave him a nod, her expression one of quiet understanding. Leadership isn't about standing above others, she said. It's about standing with them. Veronica wiped at her eyes, then cleared her throat, trying to steady herself. We want to make this right, she said. Not just an apology, but something more meaningful. She pulled out her phone, glancing at Charles and Richard for confirmation. Both men nodded. We've just made a donation, Charles explained. To the American Horizon Foundation. We saw that your airline supports programs that provide scholarships for aspiring pilots and flight attendants, as well as assistance for underprivileged aviation workers. It felt like the least we could do. Linda blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She hadn't expected this. A smile spread across her face, not just because of the donation, but because of what it represented. Real change. A genuine effort to be better. That means more than you know, she said sincerely. Thank you. The tension in the cabin had lifted completely now, replaced with something lighter, something genuine. Other passengers, who had been silent observers throughout the flight, smiled in approval. A few even clapped softly, as if acknowledging that they too had learned something today. Veronica let out a small laugh, shaking her head at herself. I never thought I'd be learning life lessons on an airplane, she admitted. But here we are. Linda chuckled. Sometimes the most unexpected moments teach us the biggest lessons. As the plane neared its destination, the energy on board felt different than when they had first taken off. The arrogance, the entitlement, it had been replaced with reflection, gratitude, and a newfound understanding that respect was never about wealth or power. It was always about character. As the plane began its descent, the energy inside the cabin was noticeably different from when it had first taken off. The hushed whispers of passengers reflected not just the unexpected turn of events, but the deeper lesson they had all witnessed. Richard, Veronica, and Charles, once so self-assured in their status, sat quietly, no longer displaying the arrogance they had carried at the start of the journey. They had been humbled, not just by Linda's revelation but by the realization that respect is something earned through actions, not wealth or titles. Linda, as always, carried herself with grace. She moved through the cabin, checking on passengers, offering smiles, ensuring that everyone felt at ease. There was no air of superiority, no need to reinforce what had already been made clear. True leadership, as she had demonstrated, was about service, about lifting others up rather than standing above them. As the plane touched down, the passengers prepared to disembark. One by one, they gathered their belongings, adjusting their coats, straightening their bags. But before leaving, Richard paused. He turned to Linda, the same woman he had dismissed just hours ago, and extended his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. The weight in his voice carried an acknowledgement of more than just her actions on this flight. It was an appreciation for the lesson she had taught him. Linda took his hand, shaking it firmly. "Safe travels," she replied, offering him a kind but knowing smile. Veronica, too, hesitated before stepping off the plane. "I won't forget this," she admitted, meeting Linda's gaze. "You've changed the way I see things." Linda nodded. That's all any of us can hope for, to learn and grow from our experiences. As the last of the passengers exited, the crew exchanged glances. They had all seen what had happened. They had watched how Linda handled everything with poise, never once needing to demand respect. She had earned it effortlessly. Linda adjusted her uniform one final time and took a deep breath, stepping onto the jet bridge. It had been just another flight, another set of passengers. But this time, she knew, it was a journey that had left a lasting impact on more than just the people in first class. So what do you think? Have you ever made a quick judgment about someone only to realize later how wrong you were? Or have you ever been surprised by an act of kindness from someone you least expected? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe in the power of treating people with kindness and respect, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that inspire and uplift. Let's spread positivity, one story at a time.